I woke up one morning to discover that the Iranian government had issued sanctions order against me. I think they called me a economic terrorist. What they said was effectively for crimes against the Islamic Republic, we hereby order the RGC and the Ministry of Intelligence and the judiciary to take appropriate steps against the aforementioned. There was a lot of mentions of Allah, a lot of mentions of the great Islamic Republic. So it was a surprise. Our security posture is significant now, both at my home and at the office, and when we travel, we take the threat seriously.
Today's guest is one of the most influential voices on Iran policy in Washington. Mark Dubowitz is the CEO of the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, a leading national security think tank that has spent decades exposing Iran's nuclear ambitions, terror network, and global influence operations. He has advised officials across Republican and Democratic administrations, testified before Congress more than 20 times, and has become one of the most recognized experts on the Iranian regime and the threat it poses to the United States, Israel, and the free world. Iran has sanctioned him personally, Russia as well. The Iranian regime has accused him of helping organize opposition against the Islamic Republic. Today, as President Trump pushes for a deal with Iran, questions are growing about the future of the regime, the future of Israel's security, and whether the world is moving toward peace or another major confrontation. Mark, welcome to our show.
Thanks, Daniel. Honored to be with you.
Mark, let me start with the question everyone is asking right now. President Trump says a deal with Iran may be close, but Bibi Netanyahu appears deeply skeptical. If Iran's leaders are watching Washington and Jerusalem right now, do they see unity or an opportunity?
I think they see mostly unity between the president and the prime minister. I mean, they had a little bit of a disagreement the other day, which was reported, where Trump used some pretty colorful language, but that's President Trump. And the disagreement was over how aggressive the IDF needs to be in Lebanon against Hezbollah. But I think you've seen, incredible coordination between the United States and Israel since President Trump has come back into office, and certainly remarkable coordination between the U.S. and Israeli militaries. So I think we don't want to make too much of one phone call and instead focus on really what you've seen 4.5 or 5.5 years through two Trump administrations of very close coordination with the prime minister.
So it would seem that, I guess, the media reports a little bit exaggerated about the tensions. Are they disagreeing about tactics or, the end game itself?
I think the disagreement is over tactics. I mean, there's a lot of media reporting. There was before the June war last year. There was a lot of reporting about tensions before the February 28th, which became the sort of 38-day war this year. By the way, some of that was a deception operation targeting Iran, where the Iranians thought that there was this great divide between the United States and Israel. And that was well orchestrated by both leaders and their advisors. But there's also obviously going to be some tension. I think the president really wants a deal. I think he thinks a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah is necessary for that. In fact, the Iranians are demanding that as any precondition for a deal. I think his priority is that deal. We can talk about the details of it and whether we think he'll actually get one. But I think for that reason, Lebanon is a second priority theater. And I think he wants the Israelis at least to cool it for now, despite the fact, obviously, that Hezbollah precipitated this war. Hezbollah has been firing nonstop rockets and drones at Israeli civilians and soldiers. And the IDF is obviously completely within its rights to be hitting back. But I think for now, the president, just over the coming days and weeks, wants to see if he can get that Iran deal concluded, and Hezbollah and Lebanon are sort of standing in the way.
And maybe if you can take us a little bit into the details of the deal. Do you think any deal with Iran, with this regime, is a wise move?
Look, I think that there is a deal to be had. I don't think he's going to get the deal that fully dismantles Iran's nuclear program, takes out, the thousands of pounds of all enriched material, regardless of purity, fully dismantles all of Iran's nuclear sites, ensures that there's permanent, long-term zero enrichment and zero plutonium reprocessing, and makes it difficult for Iran to reconstitute its deadly missile program, and stops Iran's support for terror. That's a good deal. If you get that deal, get it. I'm deeply skeptical President Trump will get that deal. So if it's a diminished form of that deal, then the real question is, what does that look like? And obviously, President Trump doesn't want to be accused of doing another fatally flawed U.S.-Iran deal like President Obama did with the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action back in 2015. I think there may be a phase one deal, and I think that's what the president really wants. And that deal is really a deal over the Strait of Hormuz, where the Iranians stop firing on tankers. We lift our economic blockade on Iranian ports. oil gets flowing, oil prices stabilize, and the economy and the inflation rate are where the president needs them to be ahead of midterms. And also it provides, significant relief to our European and Asian allies who are really suffering from the Hormuz blockade much more than the United States of America is.
Now, even if a deal is reached, can the Iranian regime actually be trusted to follow through on the deal? I mean, they haven't done so in previous deals, right? So can they be trusted?
No, of course not. I mean, this is certainly not a regime you can trust. I think the only way you enforce the deal is through the power of the United States and Israeli militaries and through the intelligence capabilities of both intelligence agencies. You have to detect if they're cheating, and you have to come down on them very hard if they are. I think, unfortunately, previous American administrations didn't do that. There's this sort of sense of, well, they're cheating, they're incrementally cheating, it's not a big deal, and we became self-deterred, particularly under the Obama and Biden administrations with the deal. We didn't want the deal to collapse, so we ignored their cheating. And they were sort of in, technical compliance with certain elements of the deal, but we overlooked the fact that they were engaged in a massive deception operation. They were not disclosing nuclear materials and nuclear capabilities to the IAEA. And obviously they had this warehouse, which became very famous when Mossad raided it and took out all this nuclear material and blueprints of how they were going to architect multiple nuclear warheads. And so clearly they had never given up their nuclear weapons ambitions despite signing a deal. And the deal itself certainly didn't actually restrict those ambitions. It did put some temporary restrictions on, but over 12, 13, 14 years, those restrictions came off. So they'd be coming off right now in like 2026, 2027. And by 2030, 2031, they're all gone under the Obama deal. So Iran would have emerged with a legal, internationally recognized, industrial size nuclear program with near zero nuclear breakout enrichment capability, multiple enrichment and plutonium reprocessing sites. They would have earned probably $1 trillion in sanctions relief. They would have built up, according to IDF estimates, about 11,000, 12,000 medium-range ballistic missiles that travel 1,000 to 3,000 kilometers that can hit not just Israel, but our allies in the Gulf, U.S. forces, U.S. embassies. They would have reached a lethal end state. By the way, also, Chinese, Russian-built military, when the arms embargo was lifted, and with all that money, they would have significant leverage. And then we would be not in a battle for Hormuz against a weakened Iran. There would be no battle for Hormuz because Iran at that lethal end state with nuclear-tipped ICBMs, thousands of ballistic missiles, hundreds of thousands of drones, a significant military, billions of dollars in sanctions relief, that would have been game, set, match. They would have a permanent control over the Strait of Hormuz, and we wouldn't even be having this discussion about how do we actually win that battle.
Do you think that Prime Minister Netanyahu understands something about this Iranian regime that Trump's negotiators may not fully appreciate?
Yeah, I look, I mean, I know the negotiators. I know the members of the team. I don't think they're naive. I don't think they're under any illusions about this regime. I do think Trump is a deal maker, and I think he thinks he can get a deal with everybody and anybody. I think the Israelis tend to be more clear-eyed and hard-nosed about who their enemies are. And I think they understand that the Islamic Republic of Iran is an ideological regime, a theocratic regime. It is absolutely committed to the destruction of Israel. It is committed to a world without America, and it will do anything it can to realize those ambitions. I think Americans in general, not just President Trump, I think Americans in general just don't understand that there are hard men with hard ideas who are not necessarily going to be seduced by material rewards. I think Americans, we're all like material girls and material boys. We want to live a nice life. We want our kids to live a nice life. Well, there are people in this world who don't, who really want power, and they also want to advance their ideology, and they're also prepared to die to do so. I mean, not only homicidal, but they're suicidal jihadists. So this regime is a suicidal and homicidal regime with which it is very difficult to do a deal that will block their ambitions. And the JCPOA was a temporary pause on those nuclear ambitions while giving them the resources that they needed to build up their terror armies and their missile arsenals. And that's why they signed the deal. That's the only reason they did, is because it basically gave them patient pathways to nuclear weapons and that lethal end state that I described earlier. I think President Trump, I hope he understands that. I think he will learn quickly that the deal they're willing to reach is certainly not going to be a deal that meets his minimum terms.
Now, if the U.S. signs a deal that Israel views as dangerous, what options would Israel still have? could Israel ultimately find itself forced to act alone?
Yeah. I mean, I think Israel always has to be prepared to act alone. And Israel has acted alone over decades against the Islamic Republic of Iran through many administrations, Republican, Democratic, where you had presidents not prepared to use American power. So I think the Israelis have to be prepared to use Israeli power. And I think the one area where the Israelis are beginning to use that power, where they don't necessarily need our support, and that is to provide maximum support to the Iranian people, right? There are tens of millions of Iranians who despise this regime. How do we know? Because they've been repeatedly on the streets since 1999. They've been on the streets in 2009, in 2017, 18, 19, 2022, 2023, 2025, and 2026. They've taken to the streets in significant numbers. They've paid a huge cost. I mean, these past round of protests in January, 40,000 plus Iranians were gunned down by this regime. And they're going to come back to the streets because they know they have no option. If they're going to live a decent life, free of repression and free of economic deprivation, they are going to have to bring down this regime on their own. But I think we have both a moral duty and I think a practical duty to actually support them. And if the United States is not prepared to do so, I think Israel needs to. And Israel has certainly built up capabilities in its security apparatus that have already been implemented and operationalized over the past couple of years to support Iranians. I think those have to be massively expanded. And there the Israelis can do what is necessary, I think, without American support. And there it's, arm the Iranians, provide them what they need to take back their country. You've got millions of Iranian boots on the ground. You don't need Israeli or American boots on the ground to accomplish that objective.
Now, what is the situation on the ground right now in Iran? Is the regime obviously that's not defeated, but it's weakened? How weak is it, and what capabilities do they still have?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what the regime has lost militarily, they've certainly won in the information operations space in trying to convince Americans that they are winning and we are losing. But I think if you take a good kind of hard-nosed reality at both sides of the balance sheet. I think on the positive side, the United States and Israel have done significant damage to Iran's war-making capabilities and nuclear capabilities. Right, have set the program back significantly. Serious damage to its underground enrichment facilities, centrifuges, nuclear weapons scientists. I think we set this program back by at least 2.5, 3 years before the Iranians would be capable of actually breaking out to a deliverable nuclear weapon. And that's significant compared to where we were before the June war and before this war. On the missile side, which I actually think is even more significant, and I say that because I think the Iranian strategy under JCPOA and certainly under Biden, and would have been under Trump if he hadn't acted, was to build a massive missile arsenal, a massive missile shield under which they could build their nuclear program with immunity. When you've got 11,000 ballistic missiles, right, capable of swarming and defeating Israeli air defenses, and by the way, the air defenses of our Gulf partners, then what you have is operational immunity, because the devastating damage that Iran would have inflicted on Tel Aviv and Abu Dhabi and Manama and Riyadh and other capitals, I mean, they could destroy those cities with 11,000 ballistic missiles, and no air defense system in the world, not even Israel's, 3-tiered system, could stop that. So with that kind of threat, and they were on that trajectory over the next couple of years, the Iranians could have built their nuclear program and there would be very little we could have done about it. And so the absolute, I think, or the most significant achievement of these two wars is to severely have degraded not only the missile inventories and launch capabilities, but much more importantly, the defense industrial base that actually produces those missiles. I mean, Iran was producing 100 ballistic missiles a month. They're now down to 0. They had an inventory of 2,500. It's probably been cut in half. But more importantly, that 2,500 would have been 11,000 in 2 years. So I think that's been a significant achievement. And, certainly on leadership, we can go through, many of the very experienced Iranian leaders who have been eliminated. I think that's always important. I think people just misunderstand that. I mean, they come from the corporate world where they know there are A players and B players and C players. And then they go into geopolitics where they think everybody is an A player. So if you kill the A players, there'll be another A player and another A player. Well, that's just not our experience in life. It's not our experience in business. Why should it be our experience when looking at Iran or in geopolitics? So many of the A players have been eliminated, including, the most importantly, I think, those nuclear weapon scientists. There's been at least a dozen, if not more, senior nuclear weapons scientists eliminated. These are the sort of Robert Oppenheimers of the Iranian nuclear program who've been taken out. Are there others? Sure. Are they as experienced? No. And so I think that's been a significant achievement. What is still remaining, I think, are two important issues. One is Hormuz. We have to open Hormuz, and we have to open it militarily, or we have to open it in a way diplomatically that isn't a resounding American success. Because if the Iranians believe that they have won Hormuz, and the world believes that they've won Hormuz, that is defeat for the U.S. And I think that's part of the strategy that President Trump is now engaged in. We can talk in a lot more detail about Hormuz. The second area is still the nuclear. There's enriched material, the thousands of pounds of enriched material at all levels of purity, 2%, 3.67%, 20%. Everybody focuses on, quote, 60% enriched uranium, highly enriched uranium, about 900 pounds worth. I think that is very misleading to talk only about the 60% because the nuclear physics of this, I don't want to get into too much detail, but it's not linear. If you're enriching at 3.67% enriched uranium, you've done 70% of the work to weapons grade. If you're enriching at 20% enriched uranium, you've done 90% of what you need to get to weapons grade. And yeah, if you're doing it to 60%, you've done 97% of what you need. But, the difference between 70% of the work and 97% of the work is actually immaterial. And so we need to get all the material, or what Trump calls the nuclear dust, out of Iran. And there are various ways to do that, either diplomatically or through military operations. And then the final thing is there's something called Pickaxe Mountain, which is a site near the destroyed Natanz facility in Iran. And it's literally a site that is buried under a mountain where the Iranians are going much deeper, even than the severely degraded Fordo facility that was severely degraded during the June War by American bombers, massive ordnance penetrators dropped by B-2 bombers. The problem with Pickaxe Mountain is if the Iranians complete it, it becomes an enrichment facility, a weaponization facility, and a centrifuge manufacturing facility, and we can't destroy it from the air, or at least I don't think we can destroy it from the air, even with those massive ordnance penetrators. So we have to either get it shuttered diplomatically, or there has to be some military mission to make that facility inaccessible to human beings for 100 years. And there are various ways to do that, which I wouldn't want to discuss on a public podcast.
Now, you've been studying the Iranian regime for decades. Do you think that the regime is weaker today than at any point in your career? And who exactly is, the U.S. negotiating with at this point? I know you said that the top leaders are gone. Who are they negotiating with? Are they getting any, better terms with these people than they would with the top leaders? Maybe you can go to that.
I do believe they're weaker than at any time in 47 years. I mean, it's hard to compare. I mean, the Iran-Iraq war was a pretty brutal time for Iran, but this is a regime that is economically bankrupt, militarily defeated, politically at no point in, I think, in Iranian Islamic Republic history has there been a bigger divide between the leadership and the people. So I think this is a regime that is truly suffering a crisis, and our job is to intensify that crisis and to cripple the regime and ultimately collapse it. And again, I think we're closer to that than any time, certainly in the 23 years I've been working on Iran, but I would argue in the 47 years of the Islamic Republic's history. It also reminds me that one can never predict when these regimes go down. I was studying I was doing Soviet studies at McGill University, Montreal, 1989. It was like a cold winter's day, managed to make it to class. And we're sitting there and the professor came in and she said, please, everybody get up. I'd like you to take your textbooks and throw them into the garbage bin next to me. And we said, well, professor, we spent $40 on those textbooks. Why would we do that? She said, please throw them in the garbage can. We did. We sat down and she said, the reason I did that is because everything in that textbook that I taught you was wrong. The Berlin Wall just came down. Now, of course, this was like pre-internet, pre-smartphone, like we were in information blackout. So we didn't know, but the Berlin Wall had just come down. And 2 years later, the Soviet Union collapsed. And of course, if you're, old enough, a child of the 70s or the 80s, you were shocked by that because the Soviet Union was a massive superpower. It had thousands of nuclear-tipped ICBMs aimed at our cities. It had industrialized faster than any economy in history. It had a huge army. It just seemed like the Soviet Union would be with us for centuries, and it went down. So you never know when the Islamic Republic will go down, but I think you can start to see the cracks, and you can start to see over the horizon a real possibility that this regime will go down, particularly again, if, and just getting back to this theme, if we can support millions of Iranians the way President Reagan supported millions of anti-Soviet dissidents, who really helped bring down the Iron Curtain. So that's my assessment of sort of how strong the regime is. I think in terms of leadership, there's new leadership. Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, who ruled for 37 years, is dead. He's been replaced by his son, Moshtaba Khamenei, who, has been severely injured. No one's seen him publicly. He's taking meetings with only one or two Iranian officials. A lot of the communication is by paper, not by electronic communications, because he's deathly afraid the Israelis will do to him what they did to his father. And then you've got, this guy Kalibaf, who is the speaker of the Iranian parliament, which is a kind of a fake job. He's a former IRGC commander. This guy Vahidi, who is the current IRGC commander. Jalili, again, sort of one of these like ideological, real hardliners. But there's this sort of myth around that I reject, which is that, well, before the wars, we had a pragmatic government that was capable of dealing with us, and where the IRGC had some power, but at the end of the day, Ali Khamenei, the supreme leader, was the ruler, and he was pragmatic. And now, because of the wars, the IRGC has taken over, and now we have Moshtaba Khamenei, who is more hardliner than his father. I reject that. I think that's nonsense. I think the IRGC and the hardline clerics were in charge before. The hardline clerics and the IRGC are in charge now. The only difference is that Moshtaba Khamenei is not as astute and as experienced as his father, and Vahidi and the others in the IRGC command structure are not as experienced as their predecessors. And so I think it's same group of hard men, less experience, and are making some significant mistakes that probably Ali Khamenei would not have made if he were still supreme leader.
Now, Iran sanctioned you personally. Why did they do that? And what does it feel like? What did it feel like for you? If you can take that, give us the details on that.
Yeah, I woke up one morning to discover that the Iranian government had issued sanctions order against me. I think they called me a economic terrorist, and they sanctioned me and FDD, the organization where I work. And what they said was effectively, for crimes against the Islamic Republic, we hereby order I think it was the IRGC and the Ministry of Intelligence and the judiciary to take appropriate steps against the aforementioned. It was quite flowery. There was a lot of mentions of Allah, a lot of mentions of the great Islamic Republic. So it was a surprise, and I was heartened by the response. I got a great response from people in Washington. There was a letter that was organized by a woman named Danny Pleka, who works at AEI, and I'm grateful to Danny. She went out and got a lot of former Clinton, Obama, and Bush officials and Trump officials to sign the letter saying that this threat against Mark and FDD was a threat against all of us. So there was a lot of support from the Biden administration. A lot of support from the Trump administration. Happened in 2019. Trump administration officials came out on then what was called Twitter, blasting the regime. So that was heartening. And again, I see it for FDD as a badge of honor, but it had some complications for security, and our security posture is significant now, both at my home and at the office. And when we travel, we take the threat seriously. And then a few years later, I got sanctioned by Russia as well, which also sort of came out of nowhere. We do a lot of work on Russia, but I think the Russian one I was just put on a long list of people who have said something about Russia. So the Russia one was, I think, less concerning. And from their perspective, kind of, they were less considerate about it. But the Iran one, I think, is serious. But our response at FDD is just to double down and work even harder to bring down the Islamic Republic of Iran. I would just say that since then, 5 of my colleagues have been sanctioned, and the Iranians have tried to kill the president twice. They've gone after Ivanka Trump, his daughter. They've gone after former Trump administration officials, and also they've gone after Iranian Americans on our soil, including my friend Masih Alinejad, who they've tried to kill 4 times. And there've been terror plots that have been broken out by the FBI, and there've been court cases and convictions and imprisonments in New York as a result of that. So yeah, no, there's people who are facing far more than we are, and this is just the nature of this regime.
Now, you also studied China. Which long-term threat worries you more? Is it Iran or China? And are Americans making the same mistake with China that they made with Iran?
Yeah, I'm not a China expert. We got a great team of China experts at FDD, including Matt Pottinger, who heads our China program, Craig Singleton, and a number of others. Mark Montgomery, Brad Bowman. These are experts at FDD who really work the China issue. Elaine Dzinski, a great group of people. And I would say, I think I agree with them that the number one threat to the United States and to Western democracies over the next decades comes from the Chinese Communist Party. I think there's no doubt. The Islamic Republic is a threat. A nuclear armed Iran with ICBMs targeting the American homeland would be a significant threat. And of course, the Iranians are terrorists active on American soil trying to kill Americans, as we just discussed. I think the Chinese are a different kind of threat, but they are a superpower. They're a military power, an economic power, a technological power, by the way, an ideological power. I mean, I just had a piece in the New York Post talking about how TikTok has been manipulated, or the algorithm of TikTok has been manipulated by the Chinese Communist Party in order to push pro-Iran, anti-American propaganda out on TikTok feeds. And it's no surprise that the demographic that most opposes the war in Iran in America is the 18 to 29-year-old demographic that they spend their entire days on TikTok. And so by manipulating that algorithm, the Chinese, on behalf of their Iranian partner, have done a very good job of helping Iran win the information war. So you can see how China and Iran work very closely together. It's not just in information operations, but I mentioned that very dangerous ballistic missile program. I mean, the Chinese have provided considerable help to Iran in building those missiles, in rebuilding those missiles, in providing key precursor chemicals and other technologies that Iran needs. And so the Chinese-Iranian relationship is of serious concern to me. But sort of zooming out, there's no doubt that China today represents a significant threat to Western democracies, to Asian democracies, to our allies around the world in every region you can imagine, from the Indo-Pacific to Central Asia, to Africa, to Western Europe, and to the Western Hemisphere, where they are operating in our backyard. So this is a multi-decade generational struggle. It's akin to the one we had against the Soviet Union, but this is a much more dangerous, much more powerful adversary. In that respect, it's sort of Cold War 2.0, but against a power that is leaps and bounds ahead of what we had to confront against the USSR.
And what was the significance of President Trump visiting China, just a couple of weeks ago? It's not a trip that he makes often, but why did he feel it was important to go now?
I think the timing was important. I think there were discussions certainly about the Iran issue and trying to get Chinese help. I don't know how successful that will be. I know other countries, the Saudis, the Emiratis, and others who are major oil suppliers, the Qataris, major natural gas suppliers to the Chinese, have also been talking to Beijing about trying to open up Hormuz and get the Iranians to stand down. So I think there was certainly an Iranian component to the discussion, but it was a broader strategic discussion on all issues relating to China, trade, technology, military. I think President Trump was there to take Xi Jinping's temperature, maybe also lower the temperature on certain issues, find areas where China and America can work together, but also try to, get some more insights into those areas where there is serious competition, and then to lay the groundwork for, I think, a visit that Xi Jinping will be making to Washington. So, this is kind of a reminder of the 80s when, Reagan was meeting Soviet leaders. We had major issues with the Soviets, which is an understatement, but there was still an attempt to try and, have these summits, and in those days talk about arms control and trade and other issues that were major irritants in the bilateral relationship. I think the same thing is going on now. Superpowers need to talk to each other because the alternative to that is military confrontation, and I think no one wants to go down that road.
Mark, I want to thank you for your time. Really appreciate this conversation. How can people, stay in touch and find out more about FDD? Anything else that you want to speak about?
Yeah, so FDD.org is our website. At FDD on X, it's all social media. I'm at Dubowitz, Dubowitz. And if you're really obsessed with Iran, the way I am, I have a podcast called The Iran Breakdown. It's a weekly podcast. It's a micro niche podcast, but if you're really into following what's going on in Iran, you got great guests and great discussions, and we dig real deep every week when we break it down.
Okay, amazing. Thank you again.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you. If you have a 401k or an IRA, please listen. Gold is at record highs. What many people don't know is this: you can move part of your retirement money legally and without tax penalties into physical gold you actually own. Alpha Omega Gold helps you do this through a gold IRA. Your gold is real. It is stored safely. It is in your name. Learn more at ao.gold/stand. Alpha Omega Gold is our sponsor, and they proudly stand with Israel.